Just before 3 in the morning on December 8th, 2025, the Russian ammunition depot was still running smoothly on the night shift. Sodium lights washed over the yard, heavy vehicles moved in and out at a steady rhythm, and cranes repeated the same familiar motion. This place fed the firing tempo of an entire stretch of the front line, so it was classified as a safe zone outside every attack radius Ukraine had ever demonstrated. On the surveillance screens, the low layer was quietly empty. Radar-read terrain registered no objects hugging the ground. Air defense maintained only a minimal presence. When a low-level disturbance appeared at the forest edge, it was not classified in time. The first explosion occurred, the logistics chain was severed, and the ammunition depot began to glow on its own. This depot did not exist to display strength, it existed to avoid attention. Set deep behind the line of contact, tied closely to rail lines and stable logistics axes, it quietly sustained the firing rhythm of an entire cluster of artillery and rockets beyond the front. 122 and 152 millimeter rounds were stacked in long rows, storage separated from propellant charges and fuses. Loading and unloading took place mainly at night, when all movement blended into the routine pulse of the rear. For Russia, this was a familiar configuration, a matter of habit, not a point that invited questions. Distance did the rest. It was far enough to fall off the usual threat lists, deep enough to be considered safe by accumulated experience. Short-range air defense was spread thin. Panzer tore a few man-portable teams enough to be present, not enough to lock down the sky. Radar scanned high, filtered the low background, trusting that anything dangerous would have to climb and reveal itself. That smooth operational rhythm created a gap, not from a momentary lapse, but from an assumption repeated for too long. And that gap had been seen before the night shift even began. 2:33 in the morning, December 8th, 2025. The long-range drone did not come in like a missile. It stayed low, hugged the terrain, threaded along tree lines and structures to shrink its signature until radar had to choose how to see. At that altitude, the system faced an operational decision. Treat the signal as background or elevate it into a target. Most of the time, it chose the familiar option, filter the background, because the background is always more plentiful than the targets. At the depot, the rhythm still felt normal. Vehicles moved along their assigned routes, loading teams worked in sections, yard lights made every movement look orderly. The guard post heard a small engine but lacked a track clean enough to turn suspicion into an alarm. A report was sent upward, brushed the priority layer, then sank beneath the other noises of the night shift. For the next few minutes, the depot continued to operate as if the sky were completely clear, because nothing was clear enough to force a change in rhythm. Just before 3 in the morning, the first strike did not hit the core storage. It struck the unlocking point, the loading coordination area, and the edge of an auxiliary store enough to produce heat flash dust and a blast that pulled the entire yard's attention in one direction. That explosion was not meant to end things. It was meant to break the rhythm. And once the rhythm was broken, the entrance truly opened. As soon as the opening blast ended, the ammunition depot immediately shifted state, and the loading rhythm snapped in half. Reflexes kicked in before orders could fully take shape. Kamaz and Ural trucks waiting to depart were pulled off course into open yards. Loading teams abandoned their positions to converge on the fire point. Firefighting units deployed water lines directly across lanes originally designed for circulation. Within 2 to 3 minutes, the internal network self-locked under its own traffic vehicles blocking vehicles, people blocking people, as every route pointed toward a single point and every decision was drawn toward a rising heat source. The air defense layer was still present, but thin at precisely the wrong altitude. A cluster of Pantsir S-1 and Tor M2, positioned a few kilometers from the depot, was enough to create the feeling of having a roof, not enough to build a continuous cover. Igla and Verba teams raised their launchers, yet still lacked a clean corridor to lock onto. The drones held low altitude in the band from 60 to 150 meters, flying behind fire-glow metal roofing and tree canopies, making the targets not disappear but merge into the observation background itself, a background now self-radiating and constantly changing. On the surveillance screens, the air picture steadily lost clarity with each scan. Heat flashes and smoke spread and layered over one another. Electro-optical channels caught glare and smoke columns before catching targets. Faint tracks emerged, late fragmented, hovering at the classification threshold. Low-altitude radar was forced to distinguish between ground and what was clinging to the ground, while the background itself was emitting due to fire and debris. In a depot already burning, this became a time problem, and every background filtering cycle cost another 30 to 90 seconds of interception window. At speeds of 120 to 160 kilometers per hour, that delay was enough for each drone to advance several more kilometers without ever being firmly locked. At the local command level, the question accident or attack slipped the decision rhythm by exactly one step. Communications clogged as radios, phones, and internal lines all activated at once, and the order to raise the alert status across the area arrived only a few dozen seconds late, but in a depot heating up every second counts. Within that delay, reflexes self-organized. Attention concentrated on the firepoint firepower followed the most visible directions. Vehicles and manpower clustered around the zones emitting heat. As fire engines arrived and trucks clustered together, thermal signatures intensified and movement increased, brightening the foreground while thinning the rear. The next wave of drones, therefore, came in low hugging. The forest edge skimming warehouse roofs and slipping through structural gaps, appearing on screens as weak intermittent tracks. Panzer S1 and Tor M2 were forced to choose within a picture already smeared. Every choice made short-term sense, and precisely because it made sense, the interception net was stretched thin. On the ground, the chain of reflexes continued to tighten itself. Trucks pulled into open yards, created additional heat clusters, access routes, jammed solid firefighting lines were cut by fragments and stray rounds, and the ammunition depot ceased to be treated as a single incident point and instead became a continuous heat source. The break came, according to material logic, when one unit entered a sensitive zone where propellant charges and detonators were stored separately. The next explosion did not need to be the largest. It only needed to cross a threshold. From that moment on, firefighting became mere delay, and once a system has been dragged into delay, it only needs to be held there for one more cycle. Once the threshold was crossed, the ammunition depot no longer listened to humans. It listened to physics. The auxiliary stores blew their lids first, not simultaneously, but in a short chained rhythm, spaced by a few seconds, and each beat did not end a single store, but hurled heat and fragments into the next, pulling the entire yard along in a cold order, from what was easiest to ignite to what had the most left to explode. What remained of coordination was only the attempt to keep one store from being dragged across the next threshold. In the vehicle yard, lines of KAMAZ and Ural trucks that had been pulled aside to reduce risk now became obstacles. Movement routes were locked by the very assets moved out to save them. Firefighting lines were cut into segments by far-flying fragments and sporadic detonations of loose rounds. Firefighting formations withdrew step by step, not for lack of manpower, but because access corridors were compressed to the point that every advance exacted an immediate cost. Smoke thickened into a low-ceiling wind generated by the fire itself, forced smoke back across the yard, visibility dropping layer by layer and then collapsing altogether. The depot shifted from a single incident point into a continuous heat-emitting zone where each passing minute dragged another store across the threshold. Above, the sensor picture collapsed with each scan cycle. Low-altitude radar had to read targets flying between 60 and 150 meters against a background radiating from fire debris and chaotic movement. Tracks appeared and vanished, breaking into short segments that lasted only seconds. Panzer S1 and Tor M2 kept trying to lock on. There were moments when a target emerged clearly enough to feel almost in hand. Then a new flash swept through the noise. Floor surged the track, split, and the shot was pushed toward a less certain option. The system was not wrong. It was forced to choose, and each choice bought only a brief pocket of relative calm before another secondary explosion tore the observation picture apart. The finishing blow came once the depot was already self-propagating. One drone came in low, skimming the roofs, slipping through structural gaps, striking the loading coordination area or the yard power station. It did not need to raise the tallest fire column, only to break the recovery rhythm. Power flickered, yard lights blinked on and off, communications fractured. All it took was another delay of 30 to 90 seconds. In a system already dragged into delay, each such cycle multiplied. And for a target flying at 120 to 160 kilometers per hour, a single interception window, missed at the right moment, was enough for the rest to belong to physics. Warehouse roofs bowed and collapsed, fragments swept across the yard, pressure rolled outward. At that point, Russia no longer lost an ammunition depot. It lost control of the process. As the fire slowed its tempo, the ammunition depot no longer existed as an operational entity in any meaningful sense. Post-strike reconnaissance imagery from the night of December 8, 2025 showed widespread roof collapses. Auxiliary stores destroyed first, and then dragging the core storage past the chain reaction threshold, leaving behind a spreading burn zone rather than a single incident point. Loading lines were torn apart, internal roads, paralyzed, partially burned KAMAZ and Ural trucks scattered across the yard, forming physical choke points that could not be cleared quickly while heat and fragments remained. The consequences did not stop at material damage. A resupply node at the operational level was removed from the cycle for days, possibly weeks, forcing frontline units to lengthen resupply intervals, reduce rates of fire, and disperse stockpiles into smaller, more distant, less efficient locations. This increased pressure across the entire rear area network, from road transport to the organization of protection for newly established depots. In defensive terms, the greatest loss was the loss of reaction tempo. Even though Panzer S-1 and Tor M2 were not completely destroyed, they were forced into a posture of arriving late, exposing gaps in the low-altitude layer and cascading into multiple missed windows of 30 to 90 seconds. One ammunition depot was destroyed, but the impact spread across the entire area. Russia now has to defend its rear. The ammunition depot, once considered out of reach, demonstrated that a safe zone is not a fixed location, but a temporary operational threshold. When the approach changes, that threshold collapses very quickly. Ukraine did not need to penetrate every layer of air defense. It only needed to break the system's rhythm and hold it in a state of delay long enough for physics to complete the rest. The remaining question is not which depot will be struck next, but whether Russia can rebuild a new safety threshold, thicker, lower, closer, and more costly, before Ukraine changes. The play opens another corridor and once again forces the entire system to react out of rhythm from the very first minutes.